Right now in Chiba Prefecture, Japan, just east of Tokyo, families are still cleaning mud out of homes that were dry 2 days ago. And Japan's National Weather Agency has just given this event its own official name, because they already know they're going to be referencing it for years to come. In under 12 hours, some parts of Chiba received more rain than the region has ever recorded in a single day since observations began. Streets became rivers. Cars were swallowed by rising water with people still trapped inside them. Nearly 7,000 travelers were stranded overnight at one of Japan's busiest international airports during the country's biggest holiday travel week of the year. And as I'm putting this together, the confirmed death toll stands at 8 people, spread across 5 different cities, almost every single one of them killed on an ordinary suburban road, rather than anywhere remote or unprepared. This wasn't a typhoon. This wasn't a tsunami. This was rain, an almost unbelievable amount of it, falling faster than one of the most disaster-prepared countries on Earth could move it out of the way. Let's break down exactly what happened, why it happened where it did, and why this event is genuinely reshaping how Japan thinks about extreme rainfall risk. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this, because I cover breaking disaster events like this constantly, and this is exactly the kind of story that deserves a full, accurate breakdown instead of just a scary headline and a few seconds of flood footage. Let's start with the timeline, because understanding exactly how fast this event escalated is central to understanding why it caught so many people off guard, despite Japan's extensive weather warning infrastructure. Late on Thursday, August 13th, 2026, bands of intense rain formed over Chiba Prefecture and, critically, stalled there. They didn't move through and clear out the way a typical rain band does. They sat in place, dumping torrential rainfall onto the exact same ground hour after hour. By roughly 7:30 that evening, the Japan Meteorological Agency issued a level 5 heavy rain emergency warning for Chiba, the highest level on the entire warning scale, and something worth understanding clearly, because level 5 doesn't mean prepare for a disaster that might be coming. It means the disaster is already underway and has moved beyond the point where evacuation can be guaranteed safe. Over the course of that single night, the agency issued 25 separate emergency bulletins, specifically for record-breaking short-term heavy rainfall, an extraordinary volume of urgent alerts compressed into just a few hours. By Friday morning, the totals coming in from monitoring stations across the prefecture had broken records that had stood for decades. At the main Chiba station, the Japan Meteorological Agency recorded 351 millimeters of rain, just under 14 inches, in a single day, the highest daily total in a record that stretches all the way back to 1966. The previous record for that station stood at 259 millimeters. This event didn't edge past that mark. It obliterated it. In some areas, 24-hour totals reached as high as 360 to 367 millimeters, well beyond 14 inches, surpassing a separate regional benchmark of 309 millimeters that had been set back in October of 2013. To put that in terms that are easier to visualize, multiple locations across Chiba effectively received what would normally be roughly 3 months' worth of August rainfall compressed into about half a day. I want to explain the meteorology behind why this happened, because understanding the mechanism actually tells you a lot about why events like this are becoming a growing concern in Japan specifically. What formed over Chiba that night is a pattern Japanese meteorologists call a linear precipitation band, essentially a long, narrow corridor of intensely organized thunderstorm cells that keep regenerating and training over almost the exact same stretch of ground, one after another, like a conveyor belt of downpours, all following the same track. This is fundamentally different from a broad, sprawling rain event that spreads heavy rainfall out across a wide area and therefore dilutes its intensity in any one specific location. A linear precipitation band concentrates an enormous volume of moisture into a narrow geographic corridor, and if the broader steering winds aloft are weak enough that the band doesn't get pushed along and dispersed, it can effectively park itself over the same towns and cities for hour after hour after hour. That's exactly what happened here. The atmospheric setup didn't just produce intense rainfall, it produced intense rainfall that refused to move, which is precisely the ingredient that turns a heavy rain event into a record-breaking flash flood disaster. Now let's talk about what that rainfall actually did on the ground, because the human impact of this event unfolded with genuinely brutal speed. Japan's Chiba prefectural government confirmed the death toll at 8 people spread across 5 cities, 3 in Chiba City itself, 2 in the city of Sakura, and 1 each in Ichikawa, Kashiwa, and Yachiyo. Several of these deaths specifically involve people caught in vehicles on flooded roads as water rose around them faster than they could react, including at least 1 person who became trapped inside a car that was completely submerged. 1 additional person remained missing as search efforts continued, and Japan deployed military personnel from the Ground Self-Defense Force specifically to assist with search and rescue operations in the hardest hit areas. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it says something important about how this disaster actually killed people. This wasn't primarily a story about buildings collapsing or landslides burying homes, though landslide risk absolutely remained elevated on the saturated ground. This was overwhelmingly a story about ordinary people driving on ordinary suburban roads during what should have been an unremarkable evening commute. Roads that transformed into fast, moving, waist-deep or worse floodwater in the space of an hour or two. Chiba's governor, Toshihito Kumagai, described the situation in genuinely stark terms, calling it an extraordinary and unprecedented situation, and stating directly that, despite having responded to numerous disasters throughout his career, he had never personally experienced anything quite like this one. The scale of the displacement this event caused is staggering when you look at the actual numbers. Roughly 230,000 residents across Chiba Prefecture were advised to take shelter, with approximately 102,600 of them placed under formal mandatory evacuation orders. As of 6 o'clock the following morning, Friday, August 14th, more than 7,300 people were actively sheltering at 359 separate evacuation sites spread across 39 different municipalities throughout the prefecture. In Chiba City specifically, one of the hardest hit areas, hundreds of people spent the night wrapped in foil emergency blankets inside makeshift evacuation centers set up in government buildings, waiting out the worst of the flooding with whatever shelter they could reach on short notice. Emergency officials tracked flood danger across the prefecture's river system with genuine precision throughout the night, recording level 4 flood danger information, meaning a serious, elevated warning level on 8 separate rivers, and issuing level 5 flood occurrence information, the highest possible designation, meaning flooding was already confirmed and actively happening. Specifically for the Narita River, where monitoring cameras captured the river actually overflowing its banks in real time as officials watched. Transportation infrastructure across the region essentially buckled under the sheer volume of water. Major highways throughout Chiba were closed for safety, and highway operator Nexco East reported that drivers forced onto alternative routes created severe traffic congestion across whatever roads remained passable. Rail service across the prefecture was extensively suspended as floodwater inundated both roads and railway lines simultaneously, cutting off multiple transport corridors at once. In one particularly dramatic rescue operation, the Ground Self-Defense Force evacuated approximately 4,000 people from Soga train station after they became stranded there for hours as the surrounding area flooded around them. But the single most visible symbol of this disaster's timing and scale became Narita International Airport, one of the primary gateways serving the greater Tokyo region. This event struck during the middle of Japan's Bon holiday week, one of the busiest travel periods on the entire national calendar, when millions of people are simultaneously traveling to visit family across the country. Nearly 7,000 passengers ended up stranded overnight at Narita as train service out of the airport ground to a halt, forcing travelers to wait through the night inside the terminal with no way to actually leave and continue their journeys. Service partially resumed Friday morning with delays as conditions slowly improved and flights in and out of Narita were reported operating normally again by Friday, even as the ground transportation network around the airport continued working through the backlog. The power and utility infrastructure across Chiba took a serious hit as well. Tokyo Electric Power reported peak outages affecting more than 20,000 households after floodwater. Physically entered electrical substations, forcing utility crews to cut power in affected areas both for immediate safety reasons and to prevent further equipment damage. Gas supplies to thousands of additional households were also temporarily interrupted as utility companies worked to secure infrastructure across the flooded zones. Dozens of homes across cities, including Ichikawa, Kashiwa, Sakura, and Chiba itself, suffered flooding damage ranging from below-floor water intrusion to full above-floor flooding, meaning water rose high enough inside these homes to damage furniture, electronics, and in many cases the structural flooring and drywall itself, damage that in Japan's humid climate creates a serious secondary risk of mold growth if it isn't addressed and dried out quickly in the days following an event like this. As Friday progressed and the rainfall itself finally began to ease, Japan's disaster response shifted from active rescue toward a more measured recovery phase. And the prefecture's evacuation order timeline actually tells a genuinely useful story about how a flood emergency like this gets stood down safely, rather than abruptly. Different municipalities lifted their evacuation measures at different times as local conditions actually improved on the ground, rather than all at once based on a single blanket announcement. Inzai lifted its evacuation measure at 1710 local time. Ichihara followed shortly after at 1648. Wamashiro Sato lifted its own measure earlier at 1535. Meanwhile, a level 4 evacuation, order issued specifically by Chiba City itself, remained active and displayed well into the afternoon, reflecting the fact that the hardest hit to urban core of the prefecture needed more time before officials were confident it was genuinely safe for residents to return. The Japan Meteorological Agency downgraded its most severe warning across more than a dozen municipalities in Chiba as the rain subsided Friday morning, but critically, forecasters also warned of additional rain expected later. That same day, meaning the emergency wasn't simply over the moment the heaviest bands finally moved on. And this is a genuinely important point that doesn't get enough attention in the immediate aftermath of an event like this. Even once active rainfall stops, and the most dramatic flooding recedes, the danger from an event of this magnitude doesn't disappear along with the water. Ground that has just absorbed close to a third of a meter of rain in half a day remains fully saturated for days afterward, meaning any additional rainfall, even a relatively modest amount that would ordinarily be unremarkable, has almost nowhere left to drain and can trigger renewed flash flooding or landslides on slopes that are now carrying far more water weight than they're structurally accustomed to holding. There's something genuinely significant happening in how Japan's meteorological establishment is choosing to talk about this event that I think is worth pointing out directly, because it tells you how seriously they're treating it. The Japan Meteorological Agency has given this specific rainfall event a formal official name, referring to it as the Reiwa 8 August Chiba Heavy Rain, using the current Japanese imperial era designation as part of the title. Japan doesn't casually assign formal names to weather events. This is the same naming convention historically reserved for disasters significant enough that meteorologists, disaster planners, and historians expect to be studying and referencing them for years, sometimes decades, into the future. The fact that this event received that designation within roughly a day of occurring tells you that Japan's own weather authorities immediately recognize this as a genuinely historic rainfall event, not just a severe but ultimately ordinary summer storm. I think there's an important, broader lesson sitting inside this disaster, one that extends well beyond Chiba's specific geography. Japan is, by almost any global measure, one of the most disaster-prepared nations on the planet. This is a country with sophisticated multi-tier flood warning systems, dense monitoring networks tracking dozens of individual rivers in real time, down to specific danger levels, a military trained and ready to deploy for civilian disaster response at a moment's notice, and a population with deeply ingrained cultural awareness of natural disaster risk built from generations of living alongside earthquakes, typhoons, and flooding. And even with all of that institutional capacity working exactly as designed, 8 people still died, primarily in ordinary vehicles on ordinary roads, because the sheer volume and intensity of this specific rainfall event outpaced what any drainage system, any warning timeline, or any individual driver's reaction time could realistically account for. That's not a criticism of Japan's preparedness. If anything, it's the opposite. It's a demonstration of just how extreme this particular rainfall event genuinely was, that it managed to produce this level of impact even against one of the most robust disaster response infrastructures anywhere in the world. It's also a sobering reminder that extreme, record-breaking rainfall events are becoming a more frequent entry in the disaster records of countries all across the globe. And that record books that have stood since the 1960s and even further back are increasingly being broken, not by small margins, but by dramatic, unambiguous ones. The kind of margin Chiba just experienced when a 14-inch daily total didn't just edge past the previous 1966 record of roughly 10 inches, but blew straight through it. So what's the actual takeaway here if you don't live anywhere near Chiba, or even anywhere near Japan? This event is a genuinely useful case study in how quickly an ordinary rainy evening can escalate into a life-threatening flash flood emergency. And the specific way people died in this disaster carries a lesson worth remembering regardless of where you live. If you are ever driving during intense rainfall and you come upon a flooded roadway, do not attempt to drive through it, even if the water looks shallow enough to seem passable, and even if you've driven that exact stretch of road countless times before under normal conditions. Floodwater on a road you know well can conceal a washed-out surface, a missing manhole cover, or simply be moving with enough current and depth to sweep a vehicle, including a heavier car or truck, off the roadway entirely. Turn around and find another route. Or if that isn't possible, stay where you are on higher ground and wait rather than pushing forward into water whose actual depth and current you cannot accurately judge from inside a vehicle. That single decision, more than almost any other individual choice during a flash flood emergency, is consistently the difference between a frightening story you tell afterward and a tragedy that makes the news. I'll be watching how Chiba's recovery continues over the coming days, along with whether the additional rainfall forecasters warned about Friday afternoon ends up compounding the already saturated ground across the prefecture. If landslide risks escalates further, or if the death toll or missing persons count changes as search efforts continue, I'll bring you a full update the moment that information becomes available. Subscribe so you don't miss that follow-up, and drop a comment below if you have any connection to Chiba or the greater Tokyo region, or if you've ever experienced a flash flood event anywhere that escalated far faster than you expected it to. I read every one of these, and they genuinely help put a human perspective on events like this that can otherwise just feel like numbers and statistics on a screen. Stay weather aware wherever you are, because as this event just proved, even in one of the best prepared countries on Earth, record-breaking rainfall can outpace any system built to handle it. I will see you in the next one.